Might have a little bit of a smaller group today due to spring one. But as a reminder, please sign in on the agenda doc. And add any items you want to chat about today to the agenda as well. Give people 2 more minutes to show up. All right, let's kick things off. So definitely don't see any new faces today. Any release planning updates? We don't have Emily here, but Javier, give an update on the platform side.
Yeah, there's nothing really immediately being worked on other than the stuff for pack 014.0, which isn't until later this month. So not much to say there.
Sounds good. For posterity's sake, I'll do the RFC review, even though we don't have a, quite enough people here to make decisions on things. Give me 1 second to.
Is everyone just at spring one?
Yeah. I got a bunch of people at spring one. At Mixins, any updates?
Yeah, so this is a new PR. I split app mixins into 2 PRs. Wow, that's a lot of commits. But take a look at it. I felt pretty good about how I split it out like into the 2 different concepts of sort of the interface in the project TOML for specifying mixins, and then the implementation of stack packs. And I actually feel a lot more comfortable adding more detail than I had before for stack packs into the other RFC. So for the most part, the content's the same, but give it a scan. And I put the old one into draft. And once we're comfortable with this, I'll close that.
It's supposed to be 1 parenthesis there, or 1 bracket there, probably.
Yeah, I'll fix that.
Looks good. Any questions about app mixins? I encourage everybody to dig in deep. I think it's a really important feature. And then stack build packs, that's the other half of that. Anything to call out about that one in particular?
Nope, just good luck.
Cool. Build packs should be able to provide the default process for an app. This is one that Natalie opened yesterday. Should we wait? I see she couldn't make it today. Should we wait until she can make it to dig into that a little bit? Is that the plan?
That's
yeah,
up
I
to
think
you.
she just.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to say, she just asked me to relay that since this is fairly fresh, she just wanted to kind of ask that people take a look at it. If we want to have conversation, I'm sure this is all recorded, so she should be able to catch up if we needed to.
I have some. I'm skeptical that the process type selection should come from the build pack, and definitely want to chat about that. So, and I'm out until next Wednesday. So I may hold you up a little bit there. Sorry.
Do you want to talk about that today? Should we put that on?
Yeah,
the
I
agenda?
think we should talk about it. I have some insight as to why we're wanting this change. So it'd be nice to ping pong some ideas.
Sounds good. You want to add that to the agenda? Cool. Relaxed mixing contract. This is just waiting on me to resolve. We're going with one option and not another option here between the two things. So it's just blocked on me. Label RFCs with spec. No forest today.
I think that's an FCP, but I think Ben
Yeah.
put it in the end of last week, so I think we still have
Quite a while.
2 days ago. Yeah, so we can do it on next Wednesday.
Sounds good. Author creates repo issues. Still some controversy here or something. Is that?
Yeah, I think it's just there's controversy around the onus of who should do the work. I think people are excited about the work being done. And then we were waiting for the author to, I think, come back from PTO. Is that right?
Yeah, that sounds right. Project descriptor flexibility.
I think we need to come back with, Ben's ask was come back with concrete example.
Cool. Pack subcommands.
I'd like to know what the status of that is, if there's any hangups there.
Any thoughts?
I think it has enough to go in FCP.
I meant to add my approval to this one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Cool. Get up slow. Okay. Next one is experimental features. Joe, I think you just wanted to call a vote on this one, right?
Yeah. Did it get
Cool.
votes?
We could take a look.
Oh, I think, yeah, there might have been.
I think I had a comment.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah, there's one. I think there's one that I will address, and then we'll revisit it next week.
Sounds good. Offline build packages. Dan, is this one you wanted to talk about today? Any updates here?
There's just like 3 proposals for the last little bit of how we want to actually expose layers that are unzipped that we then retar, and artifacts that we kind of double archive or double compress. And I think Ben felt pretty strongly about some of this stuff, so figured this will need to go through him.
Maybe defer more conversation until next week when spring one's over. Cool. And then the rest are drafts. So we are done with the review process. And next thing on the list is default process type. Let's talk about that. Do you want me to talk about why I'm skeptical first, or do you somebody want to try to pitch it?
I'm gonna try to sell you first.
Yeah.
Should we just explain what it is first?
That's probably a good idea.
What do you think it is, Stephen?
I think we're saying we want Buildpacks to be able to express what the default process type should be for an application. So like you build an app and it maybe outputs web and worker and something else. And maybe generously, like the application may only really be a worker application, or it may only really be a whatever, right, web process. And so would it make sense for a build pack, maybe one build pack, the last build pack, some build pack, to be able to say, hey, this is the process type we should set up by default. Does that seem right?
Yeah, and if I recall correctly, the last one would win, right, if there is some contention. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much the gist, the last I understood it. But to be fair, I haven't read through this RFC, but maybe we could talk about some of the reasons why that would be a bad idea.
So I have things at all kind of different levels for that I'm worried about with introducing build pack selecting the process types. One is any time where we have a behavior where a later build pack, like the order of the build packs, affects the outcome. I feel like we should have a strong reason for having that behavior, because it can be confusing when the order isn't necessary. It creates extra rules you have to think about when you're creating these configurations. Like, I think a really nice thing we've done compared to Cloud Foundry did a multi-build pack thing that looked a little bit like Cloud native build packs, like with different directories for each build pack. And a big problem there we had is the last build pack was very special, right? And so one thing I really like we've done with Cloud native build packs is all the build packs are generally pretty equal. And when there's an ordering, it's because there's a hard dependency. You need Node to run npm, right? Something like that that's obvious to the end user, or process types override each other. Like I don't really like that, but like it's a thing that has to be resolved, right? And to me, like, this is a place where we're introducing an arbitrary selection by a build pack that can drastically change the behavior of the application depending on orderings that aren't as relevant. That's like a high level philosophical one. A little more concretely about process types. To me, process types are like highly conventional. They're like web or worker, right? They're not like my Rails app or your Rails app or something like that, right? So like, I feel like when you're running them, you have a lot of like, it's highly tied into the platform you're building them on. It feels like it's a little more closely integrated to the user and the platform, if that makes sense. But yes, we're going to use this, yes, the system builds web applications, or yes, I have a web application and that's the thing I want to run on this image, right? Or a worker application, than it does to the build pack author who's trying to implement some unit of functionality that is responsible for building into the image. Does that make sense?
It does. I guess the latter part of the conversation is kind of what worries me a little bit, because I'm not sure that I completely agree, or I think that maybe that attachment of, these very specific conventions and how they relate to any specific platform, maybe I just don't see that on a day-to-day. But from a more practical standpoint, I guess I could speak to where this came from. And it was the idea that we wanted to remove the default, right, of web. So removing that convention that, and most build packs are going to likely create a web process type. And so the lifecycle at some point was opinionated and said, hey, that's going to be the default one, right? And so we took that away, and then it was up to the platforms, and in this case, we're talking about Pack, to then say, hey, you specify what default process type it should be. But the problem then becomes that Pack during the build process, or even before the build process, doesn't necessarily know what the process types are going to be that the build packs provide, right? So I feel like we have that maybe this chicken and egg problem where the pack is trying to kind of imply this is what the default should be, but we have no idea what it actually can be. And so it's hard for us to rely on conventions, because although they're conventions, they're not guaranteed, right? And I think that's where it kind of puts the user in a very potential bad spot where their application is no longer runnable, right?
It seems like we're, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'm trying to work out if this is the best of both worlds or the worst of both worlds. If we were to say each of the build packs could contribute its impression of what the default process should be, and we could leave it up to the platform to then decide how to interpret each of the build packs.
So I think there is no platform when you're just doing a Docker run of this image, right? And I think maybe that's the use case that I'm looking at to solve. Because the default process for a platform that executes an OCI image would be drastically different than one that a user executes, right? So maybe there are different use cases that we should think about or talk about.
Along the lines of what Simon is saying, I wonder if we're taking a technical problem, right? It's hard to end up with a correct process type, and trying to solve that by putting a responsibility on the build pack author because it's convenient to achieve that outcome of having a valid image at the end, when really it's not the build pack author that needs to make the decision. I think it's basically what Simon's saying. I'm just thinking about it a little more abstractly. I wonder if having a mechanism for which at the end of the build, the lifecycle can look at the processes that were output, and if there's no web process, then default to something else, right? Like, is there a way we can solve this without changing the build pack API, without giving the build pack author a decision to make? Because I didn't hear a need in there that's like a build pack needs to be able to instruct the image to have this particular process type because it's something the build pack author wants to control. I heard like it's hard to solve this technical problem and we want to change the build pack interface, because we don't want to have to go back into the image at the end and write, like have this complicated interaction between the platform and the lifecycle.
I mean, one of the things from what you said, though, is that isn't one of the goals to remove web at all, that lifecycle knows it all about something like web as a default?
Yeah, that was one of the previous conversations where we wanted to remove that, that notion or that insight or that opinion from the lifecycle.
So could pack default to web unless it can't find web, and then it defaults to the only thing, and then if there's more than one thing and neither are web, then it fails unless you specify dash.
So, I mean, we talked about this at length, right? And there were different proposals brought up. And if you, like, I'm going to go with the simplest one for creator, right? Where we pass all the information beforehand. There is no spot for the platform to then interact with that building process to be able to then generate an image that has a built-in default. So even if we wanted to abstract out that logic for determining the default to the platform like Pack, we have no injection point during the creator phase. Like in the individual phases, we could maybe do something, but for that creator workflow, we wouldn't be able to.
I mean, you can have Pack, rewrite the digest at the end with a different, like look at the image afterwards, and like there are technical solutions, right? They're just not very nice technical solutions.
I think as soon as we say Pack could do this, I feel like we're failing in some degree, because then we have to replicate this, or it behaves differently across different platforms, and it just becomes a pretty gnarly mess.
Could you have the behavior of setting a pre-provided default process type to the default process unless there's only one process, and then select that one unless there's no processes, and then could you implement that in the lifecycle, but then at the beginning Pack passes web to the lifecycle as that special designated process type? I don't like having that logic in the lifecycle, but if it's the only solution.
That's what we currently have. That's what we do, right? Like that, and this all works because we still have that logic in the lifecycle that says, if there's only one, I want to choose that one. And
yeah, there's a spec PR, I think, in that Natalie opened that we put back to draft because of this RFC, if I'm not mistaken, Javier, that is really changing the spec so lifecycle does not need to have that logic, right?
Yeah, I think it's linked in the summary for this RFC.
I think my resistance to having that logic in the lifecycle may not be as strong as my resistance to changing the build
Push
pack.
It to the build pack, yeah.
Right, exactly. It feels like it's not the direction I thought it would move.
I think the people that matter, I believe Ben and Emily both have strong opinions in how this should work. I think they were in favor of this solution only because it's, if I remember correctly, it solved some other problems that they had then better control over. In that meta build pack scenario.
I think it's worth waiting until we get them here if they have strong opinions on it, because I'm not like gonna say, like, I'm very happy to be the one outstanding no, and then it goes through anyways. That wouldn't bother me that much. If other people feel strongly that we should do it.
I guess in your ideal world, Stephen, I'm just trying to figure it out because I think you bring up good points. I think there's good points on both sides, and it probably comes back to what maybe Simon was saying. Just like at some point, someone needs to decide what the default is. Like to some degree, like if we could have clean slate, like where would you want that to live, and how would you want that to work, right? Like, and I think that's ultimately like what we're trying to decide for like a 1.0 API. Like, do you think the responsibility, like if I'm the Ruby build pack language owner at Heroku, like is the impetus on me to tell you that web is the default? Is the impetus on Heroku as the platform to say web is default, even if there may be build packs that may not specify a web process type? Do we want, I feel like there was a conversation we had last week about like these smaller build packs that could just like define process types. And there was the whole like process type plus mbars kind of conversation. That's all the build pack did. I remember talking about that last week. Like, if that's really all it does, like, would it be the one who is that an API we want to provide to build pack author? I think it being the user, especially for the Docker example Javier talks about, right? Like, I think it being the user is probably not, if the user knew what they wanted to do, like they would just specify it when they ran it, right? So I think it's probably not the user is the person who's deciding what the default is. I mean, they could input into the platform to maybe do that when they're building an image or whatever, right? So I think that's always an option, but I think that's probably not the like, I think it's default for a reason, right? And so like in your mind, Stephen, like where do you feel like that fits, and how would you want that to work?
I feel like, again, I don't have a terribly strong opinion, and this isn't like, someone could easily change my mind because I think there are drawbacks to this too, but I feel like a platform should have a default, and the user should be able to easily configure what that default is, if that makes sense. So when you use the Pack CLI defaults to, making images for web. If you want the Pack CLI to make worker images, and when you're building your app, you're going to output a web and a worker process. You want it to do the worker by default instead. Then the interface I'd like to see there is pack -- process -- type worker, and that it switches the image you build over so that it builds worker, default worker images instead. But then if you build it with, if it just has a worker process type in the end, I think it's reasonable to set that to the default process type. Similarly, like on Heroku, if you build an image, defaults to web unless the user selects something, passes some command line argument, right? Same with kpack and the stuff on the VMware side.
So I guess going with that a bit. So if the platform, ultimately the platform will not know ahead of time what process types would ultimately yield from the build process, right? So like it has no way of making that determination. So there needs to be either a post process, right? Or some sort of interaction in between, like right before export, essentially, that says, okay, give me the process types that you have. And okay, out of those, I can apply this logic of if that's the only one, then use that one.
So it's like very naively, right? If we wanted to meet all the requirements and didn't care how technically gross this is, right? The platform could inject a binary into the container, right? That the creator executes to learn about the logic or to be able to run the logic that selects the default process type and parses the things, right? Like there are ways we could solve this technically if we're, willing to make.
Is that a build pack?
Architectural sacrifice.
Is that a platform build pack? Process build pack?
Process type.
Just keep going down.
Is a stack
build pack, stack pack, process build pack.
Right.
Just keep going down that train.
And
that's not a crazy idea. The binary is a little scary because it could be anything, but a well-defined interface of like how that works is also not. Like you can imagine that being part of the builder, right? Like a platform builds a builder, and maybe that's like maybe you just like piggyback on Joe's stack pack or something.
There may be other places where the platform needs a hook into the build process, right? Or needs to provide dynamic configuration at build time, right? Very much in the same way a build pack does. And like, I don't know if we're there yet. I don't know if I'll ever get there, but calling out that this is we may run into the same, scenario in the future where we need that, type of functionality.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. Right. I think it'd be nice to have a solution that solves this in a very robust way that is then also usable for other aspects that we might fall into.
I worry about adding too much complexity though, right? Already got a lot of hooks and things like that. Complicated interactions, or we're injecting code different places. I'm worried that about that aspect too.
If you can you just set C and Beam process type? Like as a Buildpack author?
I don't think so.
I think anything under C and B can't be set as an end bar. Is that what you're thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Back violation. But even if you set it at build time in your build pack, or I don't think the launcher would get it at the right time.
There is, when we talk about hooks, right, the thing that comes to mind is S2I. They have a pre-commit and post-commit hooks where you could run arbitrary executions, and only if they succeed, then does your build actually succeed, right? So they use it a lot for testing, so injecting tests before or after something has been compiled. I don't know, like that seems, again, in a very rudimentary way, that seems like it would solve the problem if it could, in that step, that post hook or post commit, be able to inspect the process types and also set additional information.
Does Pack fail to produce an image if you pass it web and there is no web? Or does it produce one with whatever process type is there if it's only a single one?
It depends on the life cycle. So yeah, the life cycle used to fail, but now I think we made it not fail. So now it warns.
Seems like this is pretty good discussion on it. I don't know if we're going to get to a conclusion here, especially without a lot of people present. And I definitely don't want to. I want to make sure Natalie has a chance to be part of the conversation a little more too, given that she opened the PR. Do we want to? Any other thoughts? Yeah.
Platform pack.
Platform pack.
Stack pack, platform pack.
Yeah, too many packs.
I don't know. I feel like the ideas you had, Stevens, actually, I don't know what that interface looks like, but it's actually a pretty good one of just like a well-defined interface that allows you to actually hook into kind of that build process as a platform. I don't know if we have besides the kind of defined interfaces of like what you pass into a creator, like Javier was saying, like you basically don't have a way to inject to kind of solve this the way you're describing today.
I wonder if this is like a stack pack, if like a stack pack is like a narrow version of a more...
there's too much control on the stack pack that you'd actually want to provide to solve this particular use case, right? Like you don't need that.
But if a stack pack isn't something that a user brings, if it's something that the platform brings, right, then like, does it matter how much control it has? It's already like, it's going to run as root, but just setting the default process type at the end, like, I think you're probably right. I'm not suggesting that stack pack is the right way to solve the problem. I'm sensing that if you step back, right, a build pack is a way that the build pack author persona, right? Somebody distributing build modules says, here's some functionality that can go into an application. A stack pack is kind of the way somebody at the platform level, right, provides functionality that goes into an application with a lot more control, right? Apt build pack level. You can pull apt build pack or you can allow apt build pack type things, right? You know, if we're talking about a hook between the platform and the build process that runs at build time, we have that, right? Does that mean that concept, is related to this? I don't know. I'm just saying, like, before we create more, specific
packs.
types of packs, right? Are we really dealing with like a more generic interface between those two concepts?
Yeah, I guess the concern I had with Stack Pack, because that was definitely the first thought I had when you're talking about it, is that do I actually need, it's just like the principle of like least privilege or whatever. It's like, I don't actually need root and like that much stuff to probably do a lot of things that maybe you're suggesting. So one is default process type, potentially other things that like once that, especially if it's running right before export, like we were suggesting potentially, I don't know when it would run necessarily, but it has to be like after the image is kind of built, at least for this particular use, or not built, but like once enough of the build artifacts are there for me to actually like do stuff there.
Stack packs don't even have access to layers, do they, in the current implementation? So.
Are stack packs the privileged realization of platform build packs or something like that? Like a privileged pre-hook platform build pack, and then what we're talking about is a unprivileged or privileged pre-build platform build pack, and we're talking about as an unprivileged post-build platform build pack.
I feel like if we make Joe rewrite his RFC again, he'll be very sad.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting a change there, but
just rename it. So I'm still not happy, to be honest, with the idea that the onus would be on the platform to determine that logic. Because from a user's perspective, me building this image, this application with this builder on my computer versus me building it on Tekton versus me building it in Jenkins should not yield a different application, right? Or a different image. And I feel like that's gonna surprise a lot of people, that I don't know that it's worth it.
I don't know if a builder isn't spec'd, right? It doesn't.
Well, we do want it spec'd as an extension spec, right?
We're talking about having an RFC for whether it should be an extension spec, but I don't know if we've decided that,
It's in the spec thing. I think there was a consensus that it wanted to be one.
I do get I just feel like it's used so much throughout various things. Like we reference it in other RFCs. Like we talk about builders that it probably should be spec'd as an extension, even though as a platform you don't need to know about it. But
like every platform uses it. Am I mistaken in that statement?
Well, for example, KPack can't consume pre-built builders. KPack can build its own builders using an internal abstraction called the builder, but you can't input a pre-built builder into KPack and have it, just use that. You have to input build packs and stacks separately.
I agree with you though, Javier. I feel like this should, I don't know, I feel like creators kind of the perfect use case, like to enable to do trusted builders. You kind of want, and yeah, we could do it with a hook, but I don't know, just taking in an input of default of, present, in lifecycle doing that doesn't seem, out of sorts. Or we could just not, the warning from pack is the problem Docker run. Do we have to, we're producing valid images. It's just that you don't have the default command, right? In this case. So like, is there a pack run? Does pack run come back and then choose your default at that point?
But I guess like, how would you choose it?
Well, if you did a pack build, that's right at the output, right? The with the warning message, it's kind of like executing a binary without the right flags. It can just dump all the stuff and say, well, there is no default. These are the ones that are present. Kind of the result of pack inspect image or something, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm against like putting the onus on the user to pick the default. I think that should be a flag that you have as a user to set the default, but I don't know if the default should be solely determined only by the user.
Well, if you know what processes are going to be there, you can set it, right? It's really just the first run situation that we're dealing with, right? Because if you build an image and you own all the, or you know what processes are going to be there. If you're trying to build like a default process, like I don't know, we kind of went away from really default process in general, and I think that's okay. Like building images that have no default, like I think that's perfectly valid use case anyway.
Stepping back a little bit, I guess, I'm very conflicted about, like, part of me feels like process types should be highly conventional. Almost everything is web, right? And that gives me one view of the world, right? And part of me feels like, well, we're actually building a kind of generic way of building containers, right? Not just about web apps. Web shouldn't be special, right? Like there's, there is no such thing as highly conventional when you're talking about just building containers in general, right? And so those two philosophies are, I feel very, very conflicted between, if that makes sense. Because the way process types are used, they are highly conventional, but then we're in a space, just building containers where that convention doesn't really exist, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I share that sentiment
Change the
as
default to runnable.
Runnable? Throwable?
Just totally out and generic. Runnable 1. Runnable 1 will always be the default.
I wonder if tackling the problem from that more basic perspective of like why do we have process types, and what's our real motivation? How do we view them, right? If looking at through that lens first might help figure out what we should do with the UX.
I feel like this makes me think of how open a lot of the stuff in CMB is, like whether it's like mixins or stacks. And probably at the end of the day, I feel like it's great that it's open, but probably users want guidance. Like I think having, even though we don't, we had that debate of like, do we produce the stack image for, this like Bionic thing? Do we just need the name? But like, if you don't provide like the one that we have for Bionic, right? Like it actually be really hard to talk about a lot of these other concepts, right? Maybe we wouldn't even have like that other mix in RFC, right? That's like, oh, for Bionic, we mean this for mixins, right? And I feel like it's not quite the same for process types, but it's probably similar where like you want to leave room for people to define like whatever they want for process types. But I think there's like, it's probably not the 80%, but there's like this like non-trivial amount of people that are like, okay, I'm building a Spring Boot app, I'm building whatever, like, just tell me this is the way to do it and not make me think about, well, like what is default process type? How do I set this thing? Like, I think people are coming here to have things be a little standardized to some degree, if that makes sense. At least that's like kind of my gut feeling on it.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, being honest, when I first came to the project, the term web kind of didn't resonate well, just because to me, in my mind, web is like more front end related focused stuff, where back end stuff is very server oriented, right? And so anyways, there's that. I do wonder, this is totally like completely on the side, but if the term itself was just default, right? And then that by convention be the thing that obviously it kind of naturally flows and it doesn't matter what it is, but process type of default is default. And I believe that kind of maybe even comes from Spring profiles. Isn't the default Spring profile default? And you could have different profiles. To me, that seems a lot more natural than web as the default, to be honest.
Do we have other prior art for process types in particular for them being things besides web? It's like web isn't even really default, right? And this is another weird part of the question. Web is just like on platforms, when you set your app to web, when those platforms run your app in a web context, they select the web process type. There's no default really on Heroku or Cloud Foundry for those things. It's just kind of how it mean, it is a default, but only in the context that they're going to run as web applications, right?
That they import, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Problem is really Docker run in the end, I think.
Yeah.
Let's just blame it on them.
Yeah, what I think the thing that's like the reason there's a lot of value in maybe it's not even the default, like you're saying, Stephen, it's just like it does special things based on the process type being called web. At least that's how it works on Heroku, right? Like if a process type is web, we actually like open up a port and allow you to connect to it, because that's not a guaranteed thing you would necessarily want or need for like a worker, right? Or whatever rando process name. And so like we special case web for Heroku. And I know like the equivalent of like setting this up on like another platform potentially that doesn't do that means that like, oh, you got to like deal with the firewall rules to like set up your web. And so like basically taking that away from configuration for users is like a huge net benefit, I guess.
That is very interesting that there is more attached to a process type name than just arbitrary text.
Well, because the alternative, right, is like if you didn't treat web special and you just treat it, and this goes back to like the port discussion we had from feels like forever ago, when we kind of put that aside of just, it means that like as a user, I have to now know how to, like, it's like the Docker run thing. Like we can always blame Docker, I guess, but not really. But it's like when you Docker run for web now, right, like, on Heroku, you don't have to do this, or a platform who treats web special, but like a Docker is not treating anything special. It's just like it'll do what you tell it to do. And so like you have to know to do the port forwarding yourself, and you have to know to do all these things and pass that stuff in. And I think that's like potentially where some of the contention is as well, which is maybe a little unrelated to this RFC, but also related to some degree.
Yeah, it definitely is not a problem that exists in a vacuum of where you're going to use the image, right? I wonder if Project Toml is the right place to put
I almost
this.
mentioned that earlier because we kind of need it. We've talked about a pre-process for Project Toml potentially,
Doesn't that put the onus back on the user to define what that is?
But maybe it's like, in Project Toml, maybe it's more like profiles, right? It's like kind of, there's a controversial proposal about, the varying Project Toml's top level descriptor name. So it could be app or function or whatever.
The one that I suggested.
Right. Like imagine that we do that, right? If it were app and it selected web, or if it were function and it selected function, or if it were worker and it selected is there's some kind of profiles or mandatory choice you have to make in Project Toml that indicates that some of these defaults that we'd set, right? Like web versus worker, right? Is there something at that level? I don't know.
That sounds a lot nicer to me. Just, hearing it, I think kind of aligns with a lot of my thoughts of where process types should live, right? They're very independent, like isolated processes, and so therefore they should have their own configuration in a sense.
Again, might be good to wait till we have more voices to chat about it. I don't know if we're going to get to a conclusion here.
What's the feedback we should write back to Natalie? Watch the recording.
Go watch the YouTube video.
Watch this video.
I was gonna.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I could add it as a comment to this PR. It's just like, hey, there's a video here, a working group video of the conversation here.
Cool. Anything else on the agenda for this week?
I don't think so.
All right. I can't find the tab I had it open in, so I'm assuming there's not an item there I'm ignoring. Thanks, everybody.